Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you, a cure for diabetes using stem cells. How tea may prove to be the cause and cure for cancer in your throat. How a particularly rare mutation could theoretically provide a universal virus immunization, possibly for days, but there's a lot of questions to be asked about how effective it really is. Evidence that apes, and particularly ape ancestors to humans, may have been walking much earlier than we initially thought. A very bad study claiming that the Incans and Mayans weren't the people who actually built their own civilization, but instead it appears to be predated considerably. There's also a rather blunt and unfortunately honest explanation of how biased Wikipedia is. These and other news items can be found in the timestamps given below. We'll start with the best news we have for you this week. A type 1 diabetes cure.
Here you can see our massive stables, overseen by the level 9 ranger, Scott Malkinson, who has the power of diabetes.
This involves a patient, so bear this in mind, it is a singular individual and therefore results will vary and may not even translate in the long term or to other humans, has been cured of their diabetes, or at least started producing their own insulin, after receiving pancreatic stem cells. This is the first time that the islet cells, that is, the cells responsible for making insulin, have not only been genetically edited so they're not rejected by the patient receiving them, but also does not require immunosuppressant drugs and does provide insulin itself, although that part of it is less new.
Why are we not funding this?
There have been previous efforts, let's say, to try and take either whole pancreases or just the islet cells from other individuals who are donating their pancreas and then provide them to an individual who is diabetic, typically type 1 diabetes, and this has worked broadly well, but it does require immunosuppression because it is effectively an organ transplant. The study in this case used a 42-year-old male patient who had type 1 diabetes and had since they were a child. They received islet donors from a healthy donor, but these healthy stem cells, islet cells, were modified so they did not produce the necessary markers for the immune system to recognize them. This means that they were able to get injections into the muscle of their forearm, and over the period of 12 weeks, those cells gradually migrated to the pancreas, where they then provided insulin production. Moving now to news that is basically proof that humanity is stupid. We have Kennedy and the case he tried to make against mRNA. Now, this is somewhat ironic and hilarious because RFKrayKray tried arguing that mRNA vaccines are no good, that they're dangerous, that the evidence shows that they just don't work. But he was also rather dumb. Unlike RFKrayKray's usual approach, in which he relies on very well-established anti-vaxxer sources and similar, he instead tried to rely on actual research and science. And he provided us with a nice long document, a 181-page document, which, given what it contained, you could really shorten it down to more or less one sentence. RFKrayKray thinks vaccines are bad, and especially mRNA-based vaccines.
Stop it. Get some help.
But this is where it gets particularly good. The fact that there's a bibliography means that we can look at these sources and we can figure out that actually anything in there that is of any substance, that is a actual reliable publication, something that has been, say, peer-reviewed or similar, is clearly pro-mRNA, as in it is very clearly demonstrating that there is a benefit to these vaccines and that any possible harm is minute, absolutely minuscule by comparison to any kind of possible benefits that might be obtained. Of course, things do get somewhat worse, or at least they start off worse, because the actual document itself isn't necessarily a meta-analysis or anything similar. Instead, it's basically a summary of various reading list items that what an admitted, and let's be clear about this, very clear anti-vaxxer thinks, because the lead author as such, the lead compiler as they're described, is the author of an, well, let's say, publication called A Toxic Shot, Facing the Dangers of the COVID Vaccines. Yeah, and of course this is also, let's say, compiled by a dentist, and not somebody who actually has any idea about vaccines, which again speaks to some pretty dumb things here. So we can look at what's actually in the document itself. First of all, most of it is in vitro studies, and this is a problem. In vitro studies are basically test tube studies. It varies exactly on what they're using, but let's make it easy and just say it's in a test tube. And the problem is that anytime you do something in a test tube, it is very much isolated and very much independent from, well, humans in general. But more importantly than that, a lot of it looked at purely the COVID-19 spike protein and not vaccination. Now, to be clear about it, the vaccine will produce part of the spike protein, but it is a shorter, truncated version which is intended only to be able to be recognized by the immune system, and basically that's it. It can possibly cause localized issues such as inflammation and that, but it's all part of the immunological response. But importantly, it is not the same thing as just giving the spike protein. Then, of course, there are the papers in the bibliography that are explicit about the fact that you can't translate it, and that the virus is very different from what it does inside the human body, or for that matter, any other host. To use one quote, one of the articles, which is, let's say, listed, directly compares vaccination and infection and says, the more favorable option for protection is vaccination. Which, given what RFKrayKray is trying to argue with this document, is very, very unfortunate. The, let's say, most damning element to all of this is that there are actual, high-quality, extensive, very reliable studies, particularly the Danish nationwide study, which looked at individuals who received the vaccine and boosters for COVID-19 in particular, and found that there was basically no risk associated with it.
Stop it. Get some help.
There's also things like the Global Vaccine Data Network Analysis, which, again, massive datasets, and the CDC dataset. So all of these things are incredibly solid research that are just miraculously missing from this document, which makes it very clear that this is not a bibliography, this is a hit piece. Moving on now to tea, and tea as in the drink here. There is a concern that consuming tea at a certain temperature may be contributing, to a certain extent, to cancer, particularly throat cancers. Now, depending on which particular kind of tea you consume, this may or may not be more or less of a concern. There are different kinds of tea that are consumed, and they come at varying temperatures, and of course, whether or not you add things like milk, whether or not you add a splash of cold water, or you simply wait to consume it. Altogether, the, let's say, evidence is somewhat mixed, and particularly given that most of the contention here is based on an IARC report, and we're fairly sure we've made our position on IARC clear. That is, they are very often overzealous, and if they're not overzealous, they're activists in what they are doing. So, the reality is that yes, consuming a hot drink such as tea may contribute somewhat to let's say, a possible risk of cancer. It also does provide a variety of other benefits, and notably things like, say, antioxidants. Obviously, an increase in fluids, given it is a liquid.
Thank you, Captain Obvious.
There are a variety of other content in it too that it can prevent cancer or at least reduce the risk. But as with just about everything in life, it is a case of moderation being key. Too much of anything is a problem and will lead to more issues. Not enough, and, well, you won't get the benefit, but you may see some of the demerits. Moving on now to something we think RFKrayKray should pay attention to, primarily because he's demonstrated an absolute lack of understanding about how viruses work, or even broadly how immunology works. A particular genetic mutation may make people almost invulnerable to viruses, and this could theoretically be used as a therapy for certain viral diseases that are proven to be challenging to stop. We should be clear, and this is a big caveat to everything we're about to say, this has been demonstrated in a rodent model using mice and hamsters, and has not shown, let's say, proper proof of concept in humans, which is very important. The mutation responsible for practical immunity to viruses is a deficiency in something called interferon-stimulated gene 15. ISG15 is the name for the gene in code terms. What this does is cause a very mild but persistent kind of inflammation across the body. This basically means the body is already primed to react to a lot of things, whether it is, say, infection, damage, or just general stress. This also means that the individuals in question were particularly resistant when they had encounters with things like the influenza virus, measles, chickenpox, and mumps. The way this typically works is that the human body has a initial very, very low level, universal level of immunological activity. This is your innate immune system. What it does is essentially act as a jack of all trades and responds to most everything. It's not especially good at one job, but it can deal with most everything to some extent. It's an excellent way of delaying the progress of a disease. Then you have your adaptive immune system. Your adaptive immune system is what produces things like antibodies and T cells. Now, T cells are particularly good at dealing with viruses, but antibodies need another cell called B cells. B cells tend to go into a sort of, storage state called a memory cell if they're already, known to a disease, or if it's a completely novel disease, the body has to take time to generate the B cells. In this case, because the body is constantly producing a very low level, but relatively higher level of the usual virus-fighting proteins that it needs, with this particular mutation, you end up with a situation where viruses can't get that foothold. They're already having to fight an uphill battle because the body's already ready to pick that fight, unlike usual where the body's normally not prepared for much of anything, but it can delay the initial progress of a virus. Obviously not long enough to stop it from taking hold, but at least long enough to give the body a good fighting chance. This is where the treatment comes into play, where using an mRNA vaccine, the researchers were able to induce a deficiency in the specific gene, that is the ISG15. By doing that, the therapy is able to basically tell cells that you actually need to make a series of proteins, 10 in particular, that will be especially powerful and useful in fighting viruses. And this has worked extremely well, it seems, at least remembering that this is done in rodents, so again, may not translate to humans and may have some rather serious complications if you do. The fact that the whole therapy relies on just 10 proteins is arguably incredibly powerful. Understand, the use of most vaccines, and we're saying this in a very broad sense, still relies on between 25 and several hundred antigens for its efficacy. This is arguably just 10 equivalent-ish antigens, although not quite the same. But as a result, it would allow for very fast, very easy resistance to certain viral infections. For example, if you have concerns about being infected with HIV, where you may have been exposed, this could be an alternative to the prophylaxis we currently use. It is important to be aware, though, that the benefits were only temporary, lasting about 4 days. So, for a vaccine, it's not ideal, but as a prophylaxis, very much beneficial. Next, we need to mock the New York Post. Not because it's a New York Post, although we should be doing that too. No, it's because they've claimed that there's a scary new, fentanyl product, a purple fentanyl, that is resistant to narcan, which technically they are true, but technically true isn't enough in this case, and it's for one simple reason. Narcan works on fentanyl. There is nothing that will stop that at all. However, there's an additional product inside this particular fentanyl product, a lidocaine.
Drugs are bad. You shouldn't do drugs. If you do them, you're bad. Because drugs are bad, okay? It's a bad thing to do drugs, so don't be bad by doing drugs, okay? That'd be bad. The drugs are bad, okay?
Which is what makes it resistant. And we say resistant in heavy quotation marks because it's not something that Narcan ever worked on in the first place. It can't be resistant to something it's not able to be compatible with to start with. And so, because lidocaine isn't an opioid, and you're combining it with a rather strong opioid in the form of purple fentanyl, you are getting a very, very complicated reaction, and arguably very easily overdosed. So yes, this isn't good, But it's not an issue about narcan, it's an issue to do with combining multiple different kinds of drugs. This is kind of like the Tide Pod challenge, in which Tide Pods are not inherently dangerous, but people consuming them in a completely different manner is. Going now to similar drug-related news, but also, unfortunately, negative news. We have shrooming, and the idea that, unfortunately, shrooms may be causing, unfortunate overdose and other complications. To start with, shrooms are more than less in a bad situation, at least publicly wise. They're currently behind a significant increase in microdose poisonings. There is a rather surprising number of products out there you can purchase that contain magical mushrooms, psilocybin if you will, and the problem with these is that they are, intended to improve mental ability and function. In short, they're basically described as smart drugs.
In local news, a Buddy Cianci Jr. high school student has been arrested for possession of drugs. The student has been sentenced to 200 hours of community service and is a very bad boy.
But most people consuming them at the moment have found that they're not experiencing smartness. In fact, they're experiencing the exact opposite. The consequences of doing something very dumb. It starts with a racing heart, and then nausea, and most likely vomiting. And then if you're really unlucky, convulsions and a seizure, needing a trip to the hospital. So rather than doing something really smart, they've done something really dumb, which has probably cost them, if not one of their kidneys, the kidney, part of a liver, and some other organ they've had to sell to pay the hospital bill. The reason for this is that there is a small amount of evidence, and we say small in that it's relatively limited for a range of reasons, that microdosing or taking a very small quantity of magical mushrooms and similar can help in certain conditions. Now, most of this research is focused on things like PTSD and depression, and not on being creative, improving your cognitive function, and so on. The reason why the research is limited, and arguably why this scenario is happening in the first place, is that initially research into this was very much controlled, almost practically illegal in just about every place in the world, and as a result it was just not done. With the relaxation of some of these rules in some areas, the consumption at a public level has gone up, because people can now do so at least mostly legally, and researchers can now start more actively looking into what it does. But it also means that the research is very preliminary. The public is very much aware of it and thinking, great, we can do this now, so we'll just experiment on ourselves. Or more often the case being that they'll just take it thinking it works anyway, for anecdotal reasons, and, anecdotes don't work. The conversation provides much greater context on exactly what's going on with this, and particularly around the quality of the products in question. Moving on now to human history, and particularly our ape ancestors, and some people have not moved on since that stage, but for the rest of humanity, the question is, when did we actually start walking? And the evidence is not quite there, but it's certainly adding up that there's a good case to be made that we were walking on two legs when we were in the forests, rainforests and similar, rather than when we were out on the plains, meaning that our ape ancestors were probably walking well before the generally accepted time frame.
All right, kids, it is now my job to teach you the theory of evolution.
Oh, boy!
Now, I, for one, think that evolution is a bunch of bull crap, but I've been told I have to teach it anyway. It was thought up by Charles Darwin, and it goes something like this.
The research does come out of the Max Planck Institute of Evolutionary Anthropology in Germany, and it found a certain link between foraging strategy of Tanzania's Issa Valley chimpanzees in the woodlands and the ape's walking way or locomotion. This does raise a question about whether or not we started making a change in our species much earlier than we initially thought, because the generally understood idea is that humans started walking on two legs once they left the forest, because it was just so much more efficient when going across non-woody terrain. As a result, the fact that we may have been walking on two legs rather than using all four limbs, or at least a lot of the time using all four limbs, is possibly helpful in talking about our evolution. Although, again, this is based on currently existing ape species, and obviously that is somewhat, let's say, anecdotal, and inferring the results to a whole species from however many millions of years ago may not necessarily hold so well. The let's say, proof of either one of these positions would very simply be fossils, but there is a relative lack of fossils from said time frame. Shifting now to more environmental news, we have transforming forever chemicals that are in water into fluoride, which would possibly be an incredibly powerful and effective tool, allowing us to, if not ideally remove them, certainly provide a much more efficient way of introducing fluoride into water, which is great for teeth health. The sunlight-activated catalyst did remove 99% of these forever chemicals, which is great, and pretty much produced fluoride from all of these. The forever chemicals are a group known as PFAS, or perfluoroalkyl polyfluoroalkyl substances, and these are found in a lot of household items, and in many other cases, cosmetics, clothing, waterproofing substances, stick-proof application to certain materials. You get the idea. They are everywhere, and unfortunately they do seem to hang around because they take thousands of years to break down. They've been used for, well, nearly 100 years at this point in time, and that's pretty much the issue. They've been used so long and so extensively that, well, they're everywhere. The large category has, however, received some pushback, with some being banned, and by some we mean a portion of the more than 15,000. So you can tell that this is a substantial issue, if not in its necessary impact immediately, certainly in its prevalence. One thing that's common to just about all of these PFAS is that they tend to consist of a head made up of charged oxygen molecules, a tail made of carbon, and fluorine. And this is particularly good because if you can break down that tail, removing the oxygen and freeing the fluorine, you now have fluorine in your, well, in this case, water, which is a common source of exposure to PFAS. And that's where this particular approach is incredibly important. It doesn't necessarily need to be done, let's say, at the household level. If you do this at the water treatment plant level, it allows for the distribution of not just fluoride for basically nothing, because you no longer have to externally source it, but it also means that you are removing a possible problem from the water supply. Something that isn't necessarily a problem, but might yet prove to be, although we're very much a fan of it, is the creation of the most synthetic life form ever. This isn't a Twitch thought or the Kardashian, although they are relatively synthetic. No, we're talking here about a completely synthetic E. coli bacterium in this case. The entirety of its body is built using just 57 of the 64 codons. These 64 codons are what has been considered to have been necessary for, well, all known organisms for billions of years. So they found a way to remove 7 of the codons that are absolutely essential for life, and therefore create a still working E. coli bacterium in this case. Admittedly, the work is not necessarily particularly useful at the moment, but theoretically, depending on how much you can reduce the size and extent of a particular organism, it could be very powerful in, say, using it for certain treatments, or as a, essentially a workhorse that is a functional and useful thing rather than a existing biological organism. For example, putting it into the GI tract and using it to monitor your health. To use a rough example, it might change the color of your poop. Not necessarily the exact method, but there are plenty of ways in which this, as a synthetic organism, could be incredibly useful. Before we get too far further, we should quickly explain what a codon is in case you aren't aware. A codon is 3 nucleotides, that is the ACGT that make up DNA. You get 3 of these in a row, and that is a codon. Typically speaking, there are 64, and we know that they make up the amino acids. You get 3 of these, you read them in sequence, and the ribosome knows to grab a particular kind of amino acid to put onto the end of a protein and build it up that way. Removing 7 of these, although again not a massive thing, does mean that the, let's say, bacterium is notably simplified and, importantly, has far less ways to make a mistake. The reason they can do this is that some of the codons have redundancy. That is, there are multiple different ways to get a codon that will produce the same result. In this case, they had 4 of the 6 codons they removed were associated with the amino acid serine, 2 of the 4 alanine codons and 1 of the stop codons. This could theoretically also allow for the, let's say, development of non-canonical amino acids as a form of codon. It could allow for the introduction of completely new kinds of codons, or it could just allow them to drastically shorten the genetic sequence of the entirety of the E. coli. Moving on now to animal-related news, we have the fact that ants are supposed to be super efficient at teamwork, although as we previously described, most ants aren't working.
In spite of yourself.
Give the man a gold star.
Underachiever, juvenile. And those are just the highlights. Oh my goodness. A ranger, maybe I get, but why the special forces?
Okay, you get 2 gold stars. Check it out. You kick one lazy ant out of an army, another one sloughs off to take its place. It's just one of those things in nature.
You're saying the military needs lazy soldiers?
The argument that 20% of ants are lazy is actually understating the issue by a long margin. This is one reason why we sort of have an objection to the research being described here in the conversation, where they talk about specific kinds of ants, the weaver ant specifically, and the fact that as a group they seem to work better by pulling more strongly together as a chain, allowing for the, let's say, more cohesive and better effort of a group, comparing it to humans, where you put a group of humans together and give them a singular task. You may be able to throw more humans at the problem and get it done sooner, but each individual human you add actually does less work, meaning you get a diminishing return overall. This, of course, doesn't necessarily mean that the same is true of ants, but as said, we've already explained how ants, despite what may be believed, actually have a relatively high rate of loafing around and being lazy, with up to 80% of ants at any one time doing nothing at all, let alone just the 20%. Moving now to technology news, we have Caltech creating what is arguably a rather amazing kind of development in metallurgy. What they've been able to do is create a hydrogel. This is essentially a very lightweight material, which contained in this case copper and nickel. This would, if just heated as is, produce an alloy of, well, obviously copper and nickel. This isn't so bad, after all, it's fairly commonly used for things like, say, pennies. It's one reason why pennies, ironically, are worth more as a metal than they are at their face value. But what about if you were to take this and you were to create a laser that could specifically hit each individual atom, that is, each individual metal molecule, and turn it into whatever you wanted? Well, turns out that's just what they've done. They're able to create an incredibly powerful laser that's incredibly accurate and remove the hydrogel, meaning that only the copper or the nickel in the specific place they're looking at is reacted, and this means they can alter specifically and exactly as they want to the composition of the metal they're making as an alloy. By contrast, the only other method we really have available at the moment is either to try and work with various enzymes, various reactants, and so on, to try and create a very specific result, but these don't tend to be quite ideal as they result in, let's say, mixed results, particularly in that there are impurities. The other option is basically throw everything into a crucible, melt it down, and hope that it all mixes in a reasonably equal amount across the board. But again, that produces other issues to do with, well, impurities and artifacts. The other, let's say, benefit, and this is probably overstating it at the moment, is that because you are practically 3D printing this by having a laser or similar thing move in a specific way, you're able to create any structure you want. And this allows for an incredible customization of the entirety of whatever it is you're trying to make. Now, this is not to say that it's going to be absolutely perfect, because obviously there are limitations on just how much you can change the configuration, but by being able to infuse one metal molecule at a time, you can create an alloy in any structure and any ratio that you want. But when we talk about particularly copper and nickel ratios, this is really important, as generally speaking, you need more copper than nickel, because the more nickel you add to the alloy, the more brittle it becomes and the more unworkable it is without breaking entirely. Using this method, the researchers were able to create a alloy that had roughly 12 atoms of copper for every 88 atoms of nickel versus the usual 59 molecules of copper to 41 of nickel, but it was 4 times stronger, despite having nearly twice as much nickel in it. And obviously it was actually able to be used, which obviously very important. And going on now, we have dumb claims about history and essentially a series of what can be best described as deceptive conduct by various accounts and people. Before the West claims that places in Peru were built more than 12,000 years ago or thereabouts. That is, before the last ice age. Which, okay, that sounds like it could theoretically be possible. And do they have some evidence of it? Well, not really. They basically claim that an aerial view was proof to start with, and then possibly some kind of carbon dating, which carbon dating in this context needs to be taken with a lot of caution, as we mentioned in another video. But the most damning aspect of all, we actually have records, basically from the time it was built, from when the Spanish arrived in South America and started conquering here, there, and everywhere, because they wanted gold and silver, and they were told, actually, this is when we built it. In some cases, there may have actually been people who were either there or involved in the construction of it being built, literally saying, no, actually, this is how old the site is. So, no, it doesn't date back to 12,000 or more years ago, it isn't from the last ice age, and there's a very good chance that this is just someone who did a really bad job of carbon dating and didn't use the right technique. Going on to more bad claims, but this time similarly screwed up in that somebody used the wrong method or didn't understand what they were doing. We have what should be a PhD, and this is all the more shameful for that, who doesn't understand what confidence intervals are, and therefore asks the question of, did the CDC mislead its advisors on the RSV antibody for babies? So, the claim in short is that the vaccine that provides immunity to some extent for newborns is supposed to have a 4-fold higher risk of seizures after injection. So this sounds damning, and, well, if it were true, it probably would be. But there's RFKrayKray levels of crazy involved in this, and unfortunately, because of that, we need to be very critical of the individual, because they deserve to be criticized. The way a confidence interval works is it's a statistical term, and it means that there is a range of values that estimates of an unknown population parameter, such as the average, are expected to fall within. Typically speaking, the idea is, if you have a 95 or 99% confidence interval, you are 95 or 99% confident that whatever it is you've found will fall within this range. This is particularly useful if you have a limited sample, for example, from a clinical trial. And as a result, you need to use these confidence intervals when you say, we are X confident, in this case, most likely 95 or 99% given it's a vaccine, that this is statistically significant. And therein lies the gap here. The claim is that there was deception on the part of the, in this case, companies, pharmaceutical companies, are trying to get this treatment out. And the claim is that because they said, okay, this is our confidence interval, and we have this many incidences of some sort of side effect, supposedly seizures, it's therefore not statistically significant because it's outside the scope of what we were expecting to find. That is that 99%. So we could say that of the 100 people in this study, 99% would not have had this experience, in very rough terms. And therein lies the problem. The confidence intervals are very important to understand what it is that they found. If you don't have those numbers, particularly when you look at, let's say, extrapolating it out to the whole world population, it becomes very difficult to prove that what you found is actually going to be reliable on a larger scale. Let's use a simple example. If you were to look at drivers, you would be able to say, if you took a random sample of 100 people off the street, 99% confidence interval that at least a certain percentage of these would drive. And you could then, if you were to look at data, try and figure out how confident you are that of those drivers, the chances of there being, say, an accident. Now, you'd have to break it down a little bit more, and you'd probably need much more than 100 people, but that's why the confidence interval is really important. because you could then repeat that experiment somewhere else with another 100 people, and you would be able to say that this is why it works. Not because the actual, let's say, sample's the same, or that the profile is exactly the same, but because that confidence interval gives you the ability to extrapolate out. And that's where this particular PhD has managed to make such a cock-up. They don't understand why those confidence intervals are so important and how they affect the claims that there's a fold higher risk of seizures, because it's not fourfold higher risk in the general population. A specific subset of the individuals, in this case babies who were treated, had a higher risk, but those individuals are not the same thing.
Stop it. Get some help.
Moving on to other dumb news, we have the MAHA, or Make America Healthy Again plan, and the fact that it is honestly just crap. Not that it's a bad idea. We will quite happily admit that it is a good idea to make America healthy, but most of what it contains is really just nonsense. At least nonsense in terms of it not needing a report to tell us.
Thank you, Captain Obvious.
It's things like be more active, eat healthier, and so on. Now, we're not saying that these are bad things at all, but this is the most dumb news ever, because it's clear that RFKrayKray is working on a very basic, very fundamental level about what healthy means, and in this case, healthy is not going to get very far, because unfortunately these are things that have been known for a very long time, have been attempted for a very long time, and have not moved in any successful way for a very long time. In a related development, we have Wikipedia, and it's again more stating the obvious than it is anything particularly useful. That is, we have the ideological bias of Wikipedia, which ironically has a Wikipedia page on it.
Exactly.
The issue here is that Wikipedia is very much left-wing, which is to say, more liberal-leaning, so your hippies if you will. As a result, there is a notable problem, let's say, when it comes to the editing of Wikipedia articles. As a result, you will find that there is an unfortunate slant, and that slant does mean that although Wikipedia has a clear, let's say, not necessarily rules, but let's say goals in how unbiased and how neutral it should be, the reality plays out rather differently, which is unfortunate. Moving now into space, we have, the Eye of Sauron, and what it might possibly be. And if you've read Lord of the Rings, you know what it is. But in this case, what we're looking at is a celestial object, let's call it, a PKS 1424 plus 240. This is a blazar, which is a very fancy way of saying a massive great big black hole with a very fancy ring of light around it, hence the name Eye of Sauron. The ring itself is, part of a galaxy being drawn into that giant black hole. The specific formation is what's a problem here. And the question is, why does it turn out to look like this bizarre target, and why is that target, so obvious? And the answer owes to the magnetic fields around it, the way it's sending out neutrino beams and gamma radiation and so on. And we'll provide you with a full link below, but a lot of the explanation really does boil down to how we're looking at it, specifically from our point of view, and why it's behaving the way it is. The last news item we have for you is more of a no-shit news item, which is rogue planets floating in space appear to be forming their own moons, which, yes.
Thank you, Captain Obvious.
If you have a giant mass sitting in space, and something like, say, a meteor flies by, there's a good chance that meteor will get caught in the gravitational field of that giant planet. That planet will then accrue these meteors, which will smash together and gradually form their own moon. This is exactly how every kind of celestial object has come to be, to an extent anyway. In the case of our moon, it's more likely that it was knocked off Earth at some point, and as a result, we lost some of Earth's mass, but we gained a moon. In the case of these rogue planets, it's worth noting that each of these can be between 5 and 10 Jupiters in size, which does mean they are massive, and obviously with massive size comes mass itself, and mass means gravitational pull, so things get to be fairly obvious here. But whether or not we're talking about the obvious or not, it's still nice to see that there are examples of what happens when you do have these rogue planets. Each of the rogue planets in question could be somewhat compared to a solar system, although not quite. We can thank the James Webb Space Telescope for the images and discovery of these particularly weird planets, and, well, obviously for many other things going into the future. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, and please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.